iceberg didn't tear a 300-foot gash in the Titanic. And that single myth hid the real reason 500 people died. For over a century, we've been told the Titanic met an iceberg, ripped open like a tin can, and sank. But when explorers finally reached the wreck 2.5 miles down, the evidence told a stranger, darker story about brittle steel, weak rivets, a missing pair of binoculars, and decisions made in seconds. Stick around, because by the end you'll understand exactly how the unsinkable ship really went down, and why almost everything you learned about it is wrong. When the RMS Titanic left Southampton on April 10, 1912, she was the largest moving object ever built by human hands, about 882 feet long and weighing some 46,000 tons. Her designers at Harland and Wolff in Belfast had divided the hull into 16 watertight compartments, sealed by doors that could slam shut at the flip of a switch. The ship could stay afloat with any 2 compartments flooded, or even the first 4, a level of redundancy nobody had seen before. A trade magazine called her practically unsinkable, and the public simply dropped the practically. Her captain, Edward Smith, was the most senior in the White Star Line, set to retire after this very voyage. Everything about her screamed safety and certainty, which is exactly why what happened next was so impossible for the world to accept. The North Atlantic in the spring of 1912 was unusually thick with ice, and the Titanic's radio operators received at least 6 separate ice warnings on April 14th alone. But those operators worked for the Marconi Company, not the ship, and their priority was relaying paid passenger messages to a relay station at Cape Race. One crucial warning from the steamer Masaba, describing a huge field of ice and icebergs directly ahead, never reached the bridge. Meanwhile, the Titanic was steaming at about 22 knots, nearly her top speed, through a known ice region on a moonless, glassy, calm night. With no moon and no wind, there were no breaking waves at the base of the bergs to make them visible. And in a final stroke of bad luck, the lookouts in the crow's nest had no binoculars, because the key to the locker holding them had left the ship with an officer reassigned in Southampton. At 11:39 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted a dark mass dead ahead and rang the bell 3 times, shouting, "Iceberg, right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch ordered the helm hard over and the engines reversed, trying to swing the bow around the berg. For roughly 37 agonizing seconds, the ship turned, and it almost worked. But the Titanic was simply too big and too fast to dodge in time. The starboard side scraped along the submerged shelf of the iceberg, and passengers later described it as little more than a shudder, a faint grinding, ice tumbling onto the forward deck. Many slept right through it. The terrible irony? Engineers have argued that if Murdoch had rammed the berg head-on, crushing only the first compartments, the ship might have stayed afloat. By turning, he exposed her most vulnerable seam. For decades, the story was that the iceberg sliced a continuous 300-foot gash down the Titanic's side. But when Robert Ballard found the wreck in 1985 and later expeditions used sonar to scan the buried hull, that gash was nowhere to be found. Instead, researchers identified 6 relatively small openings spread across the forward compartments. And their total area was startlingly tiny, estimated at only around 12 square feet, roughly the size of a refrigerator door laid flat. The iceberg hadn't torn the ship open at all. It had buckled the steel plates and popped the seams between them, letting the sea rush in through narrow gaps along the riveted joints. That sounds almost survivable, until you do the math on 6 compartments. And 6 was 2 more than the Titanic was ever built to survive. Why did the hull fail so easily? When scientists recovered pieces of the Titanic's steel and tested them, they made a chilling discovery. In the freezing 28-degree water, that early 1900 steel became brittle, shattering rather than bending under impact. A modern steel sample bent into a V in the same test. The Titanic's snapped clean through. Then came the rivets. The ship was held together by some 3 million rivets, and analysis of recovered samples found the wrought iron rivets used in the bow and stern contained high levels of slag, glassy impurities that made their heads more likely to pop off under stress. Builders had used these weaker iron rivets in the ends of the ship while reserving stronger steel rivets for the middle. And the Iceberg struck precisely in that weaker forward section. The seams didn't tear. They unzipped. Within 10 minutes of the collision, water had risen about 14 feet in the bow. Thomas Andrews, the ship's own designer, was aboard and quickly toured the damage with Captain Smith. His verdict was a death sentence delivered in mathematics. With the forward compartments flooding, the ship would tilt bow down, and water would spill over the tops of the watertight bulkheads, which didn't reach all the way up to the deck, one compartment cascading into the next like an ice cube tray. He gave the Titanic an hour, maybe 2. The unsinkable ship had been undone by a design compromise no one thought would ever be tested. And then came the part that turned a tragedy into a catastrophe. There were not nearly enough lifeboats. The Titanic carried just 20 lifeboats, with room for about 1,178 people. Yet there were roughly 2,224 souls aboard that night. Astonishingly, this actually exceeded the outdated British regulations, which based lifeboat numbers on a ship's tonnage, not its passenger count, and topped out at vessels a quarter the Titanic's size. Worse, in the chaos and disbelief, many boats were lowered half-empty. The very first to leave had capacity for 65 but carried only about 28. Crews struggled to convince passengers to abandon a ship that still felt warm, lit, and solid beneath their feet. The water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill in minutes. So for most people in the water, there was no second chance. By the time the boats pulled away, the bow was sliding under and the stern was rising into the night. As the bow filled and dove, the stern lifted clear of the water at a steep angle, and the strain on the hull became unbearable. Survivors swore they saw the ship break apart, but the official inquiries dismissed them, until Ballard's 1985 expedition found the bow and stern lying nearly 2,000 feet apart on the seafloor, proving the witnesses right all along. The Titanic had snapped roughly in 2 near the surface, likely between the 3rd and 4th funnels, before plunging 2.5 miles to the bottom. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, less than 3 hours after the collision, she was gone, taking around 1,500 people with her. The nearby Carpathia raced through ice to arrive about an hour and a half later, rescuing roughly 705 survivors from the boats. The disaster rewrote maritime law forever. Mandatory lifeboats for all, round-the-clock radio watches, and the International Ice Patrol that still guards those waters today. So here's the question. Was the Titanic doomed by bad luck, brittle steel, or human pride? Or all 3 at once? Tell us what you think in the comments, and subscribe to Fantastic Facts for more stories that rewrite what you thought you knew.